I am excited to introduce our latest six-series author, Dr. Megan Asaka. She is currently an assistant professor of history at the University of California, Riverside. And the book that she is talking about today, Seattle from the Margins, Exclusion, Erasure, and the Making of a Pacific Coast City, emerges from her award-winning dissertation and work she did with the Seattle-based Densho Project, an organization that documents the testimonies of Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during World War II. As editor of this sixth series, I had the great fortune of reading this book early on, and I've been recommending it constantly over the last year, eagerly anticipating its publication. Alongside Cole Thrush's Native Seattle and Matt Klingle's Emerald City, Asaka's Seattle from the Margins will become required reading for anyone seeking to understand the history of this city that occupies the homelands of the Duwamish Nation. I would like to thank the UW Press for their work on this series. I've been very fortunate to work with Mike Bauckham at the Press. He's the one who brought this project to my attention, and I was very excited when I saw the book proposal and the early chapters. I would also like to thank the Sick Family Endowment for making this series possible, along with For Culture, which helped to finance this book's publication. So let's please welcome Professor Asaka.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that lovely introduction and for your mentorship as series editor of the sixth series with UW Press. Thank you all for coming today. This is such a wonderful turnout, a beautiful day, beautiful setting for this talk. It's a real treat to be here at the University of Washington. I grew up not too far from here, actually, and among my family are many UW alums. So this is, UW holds a special place for me personally as well as my family. I also want to thank Kim McKeag, who's back there, who organized this event and has been a huge supporter of this project from very early on. The folks at UW Press, including Mike Bauckham, who has just been such a supporter of my work, and without whom I don't think I would have been able to finish the book during COVID. So Mike was just so supportive and helpful to me during that process. So let's get started. My talk for today is called Writing Seattle History from the Margins. And I wanted to talk a bit about how I came to this topic and what I think we can learn about Seattle history and about the history of cities more broadly by centering the voices and experiences of people in the past who were pushed to the margins of urban society. So my book opens, the introduction, opens with an anecdote of a Japanese American man named Frank Kubo, who arrived in Seattle from Yokohama on a clear spring day in June 1927. I first learned about Frank's story over 15 years ago, when I was working at the Densho Project, which Josh mentioned in his opening remarks, which is a tremendous local organization in Seattle that seeks to preserve and share stories of the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans through a digital archive and other online platforms. I was working as an oral historian and archivist at Densho when a Japanese American woman walked into our basement office with a banker box just filled to the brim with papers, photos, and other ephemera, which she had found, I think, when cleaning out her garage, and which she decided to donate to Densho, and I'm so glad she did. The papers belonged to her father, Frank Kubo, the same one who opens my book, and her collection was incredibly rich, particularly of images of his early life in the Pacific Northwest, and this is one of the photographs. This is Frank in the early 19-teens with his siblings in Algona, which is a town near Auburn, Washington. And as I was sifting through the boxes of materials with her, I happened to find a typewritten memoir of Frank's life. Oh, here's another photograph from that collection. And this is on a trans-Pacific steamship, and Frank is just a young boy in the photo. So I happened to find this typewritten memoir of Frank's life, written by Frank himself sometime at the end of his life, probably in the 1980s or 1990s. I didn't really look at the memoir at first. I didn't really kind of think about it because I was so taken with the photographs, which I'm showing here, and they're amazing photographs. And yet I'm so glad I came back to the memoir because the memoir turned out to be the most historically significant, in my opinion, and valuable piece of his collection. So after some time of processing the collection with his daughter, digitizing it, I finally picked up the memoir and started reading. And those first pages immediately caught my attention. So as I mentioned, Frank was born in Auburn, Washington, or Algona, which is a small town outside of Auburn, the son of Japanese tenant farmers who lost their farm sometime in the early 19-teens and returned to Japan with Frank and his siblings. So Frank was a US-born citizen of Japanese ancestry, but grew up in Japan. As he grew up and he became an older teenager, young adult, he wanted to return to Seattle, to pursue an education. And so he hopped on a steamship, leaving Yokohama and taking that 3-week journey across the Pacific once again. And as I describe in the opening sort of anecdote of my book, the second he steps foot onto the docks in Seattle, he's immediately kind of whisked away and pulled into this world of seasonal labor. And here's just some snapshots from his memoir, just to show you kind of what it looked like. And I'm quoting here, "Since it was already summer, all the schools were closed," he recalled. "My uncle therefore took me to Nishimura Employment Office to apply for an Alaska salmon cannery job. So a few days later, he arrives, he disembarks the ship. He leaves a few days later again for Alaska. He works for a few months in the Alaska salmon canneries. He sends most of his money that he made that summer back home. He comes back to Seattle, and he remains in Seattle during the winter. Come spring, he gets another job peddling food and supplies to Japanese workers around the region. The summer, he returns to Alaska, he comes back, and the cycle continues year after year." So when I read this account, I was immediately intrigued and also excited because he was opening up a window into the life of an itinerant worker in the Pacific Northwest during the early 20th century. And what he described of his life as a migrant worker was so much different from the stories I had been collecting up until that point at Densho. Oral histories of Japanese Americans who described a kind of different life story. They described, and somewhat maybe more familiar story to some of us, of their parents coming to the United States, of settling down in Seattle, establishing a stable life as best they could, building community institutions through hard work. And then Pearl Harbor happens and the disruptions of World War II as the singular event that really shaped their life, the major disruption that happened. But what Frank conveyed in his memoir was something much different, a life of continual disruption and uprootedness. And he was actually living in a city, Seattle, that was structured in every way to facilitate his movement around the region and keep him in a constant state of itinerancy to feed the demand for that kind of work. So, and this continued, throughout his life. When he got a little bit older, he got married and had a daughter, the same one who brought me the materials at Densho so many years later. This life of disruption persisted. He continued to work on and off. He continued to work in itinerant labor. His wife, contracted tuberculosis. She had to spend many months in a sanitarium. They struggled with money. They lived in lodging houses and cheap hotels, and they moved around a lot. So in his narrative, when he gets to World War II and Pearl Harbor, the mass removal and incarceration is just one of many moments of disruption that he had endured up to that point. So in his telling of his life, Pearl Harbor and its aftermath was not the singular disruptive event, as it was in so many of the other stories that I had heard at Densho up to that point. And so that really stuck with me, his story, and something that I returned to over and over again. It became kind of a touchstone for me. And I kept thinking about Frank's life and what I had learned just from his brief memoirs. And so in my, historian's mind, I kept returning to some questions. I wanted to know more. How common was Frank's experience, I wondered, not just for Japanese people, but for other groups as well? Was he describing something that was atypical, or was he revealing a more common shared experience among the workers of this region and of this city? And finally, if it was indeed true that he was revealing something more common, then why didn't I know this history? And why wasn't it highlighted more in the narrative of Seattle history? And so these questions, this desire to understand more about Frank's life, and others like him, drove an interest of mine in history, and in particular in researching more about Seattle's past, which over many, many, many years culminated in my book, which just came out, Seattle from the Margins. And so what I learned from this long research process was that Frank's story was not unusual at all. And if you're familiar with the book, or if you've read the book, you'll know that too. Frank's story was, in fact, very common for workers, Asian workers and Indigenous workers, as well as European and US-born white workers in the Pacific Northwest from the mid-19th century through the first years of World War II. And this had to do with the economy of the Pacific Northwest during these years, which revolved around the extraction of natural resources and agriculture. So the industries I kind of touch on in the book are lumber processing, coal mining, fishing, canneries, hop picking, and berry farming. Seattle's urban development during this time was inextricably linked with the broader regional economy of the Northwest. So one of the arguments I make in the book is that you can't understand Seattle history during these years without linking it to the broader region. And so Seattle emerged in this time as a hub of labor migration, a stopping over place for workers and others who were passing in and out of the city to work in the labor camps and lumber towns on the outskirts of the city, and also that were scattered throughout the broader region. And so when Frank arrived in 1927, he was joining a much longer migratory labor stream that was as old as the city itself and had helped to establish Seattle as a city and as a major metropolis of the Pacific Northwest. So when I was conceiving of this book, I had two goals in mind, and when I was writing it, the first goal was to reconstruct the history of these migratory workers, to follow them in and out of the city, to highlight their lives, their labors, and their relationships with each other over time. I wanted to shed light on the social history of a group that had been so crucial to building the city, and yet has largely been forgotten and erased in the historical memory of Seattle, and also in this scholarship on Seattle history. This was a population, again, that was so crucial to Seattle's early history, and yet had been almost completely written out of the dominant narrative of Seattle history. My second goal, though, was a bit different, and this was to use the experiences of Frank Kubo and others like him to reorient and reconceptualize the study and writing of Seattle history itself. So much of what I had learned about Seattle and about cities during this time period, right? This is a period of intense urbanization, of industrialization, of mass migration to the cities, was told through the perspective of stable communities, people who lived and worked in cities and established communities and institutions through slow, hard-earned growth. But what Frank's story taught me was that this was not the experience for many workers in the city during this time. In fact, he was showing something that was actually very different, in some ways the opposite of this, a constant state of disruption, and further, an entire city that was structured around this demand for migratory labor and to maintain a class of people who were able to move around from place to place. And his story, even in those brief, typewritten pages, shows this so vividly. The docks, the hotel, the employment agency, the shipping companies, the Alaska salmon cannery jobs. And so I wondered, what would it look like if we told Seattle history from the perspective of those like Frank, people who moved through the city, who only had a temporary presence in Seattle, the itinerant laborers? What insights would this produce about Seattle and Seattle history? What can we learn from Frank and others like him? And here's where I want to focus the rest of my time today. So some of the insights that I want and I hope people will take away when reading the book, things that I feel are really crucial to this about the story I'm telling of Seattle history. So the first thing is that when centering migratory and itinerant laborers and writing the history of Seattle, what becomes clear is that, as I said previously, Seattle was really structured in every way, spatially, socially, economically, politically, around the demand for mobile labor and maintaining that class of uprooted workers. And so these workers were not just occupying the shadows of the city. They weren't a forgotten or ignored population of the time, far from it. They were really front and center in shaping the city in every way. And they were very present in the minds of employers and city officials. And one way that I show this in the book is through the efforts to police and contain them. So while they were valuable and important to the economy and to the city, there was also a backlash, right, a resistance against them, efforts to police and contain them. Segregation is a major theme of my book. And what I discuss in the first chapter is that segregation really starts as the city is established in the 1850s and 1860s. Often I think there's an understanding of segregation as something that occurred later on in the 20th century, in the 20s and 30s. And yet I track a story of segregation that was foundational to the city itself and its origins. And this starts with the removal and segregation of the Duwamish, the indigenous peoples of Seattle, the Seattle region, and other indigenous peoples into the area around Yesler's sawmill, called the Sawdust, right? Settlers named this area the Sawdust. And I argue that this emerged from settlers' warring desires to establish a city of white settler families while also relying on the labor of non-white people. And so segregation emerges very early on to remove the Duwamish, to take their lands, and yet have them accessible as workers, but crucially, right, separated spatially, geographically from the settler families. And this is the beginning of the North-South division in Seattle, which is a racial division that has persisted over time. In many ways is still the kind of main division, I think, in the city into the present. This is a map actually showing kind of this division, and Yesler Way, or as it was called at the time, Mill Street, is that dividing line between North and South. And it was a really crucial kind of dividing line that remained that way, I think, through World War II. And then Yesler Mill is, right, marked at the foot of Yesler Way, right? And that was where the mill was located, and that was the area called the Sawdust, right, that emerged as the segregated space for the Duwamish. And this is important because the Chinese begin to arrive in the 1860s and in larger numbers in the 1870s as the city's second workforce. And they are pushed into the same kinds of physical territory of the Sawdust. And what I found was that the same kinds of municipal codes and policies, like laws, right, passed by the city, that were developed to police and contain indigenous workers in Seattle were then deployed against the Chinese in very similar ways. Vagrancy laws, public health laws, which start to emerge in the late 1850s and early 1860s to keep indigenous peoples restricted into the Sawdust area, were then deployed against the Chinese to keep them similarly restricted to the Sawdust and out of the northern, right, areas where the white settlers were establishing a town. And then when other groups of workers begin to arrive, as the economy expands, they are similarly contained into the Sawdust, or over time it becomes, I call it the area south of Yesler. There's many different names that this area has. It doesn't have one stable kind of identity or name, which is, I think, speaks to the fluidity of the population that lived there. And as I discussed, this segregation and concentration of people into one bounded area was sort of important for the city, but also from the perspective of the regional economy. It gave employers around the region a concentrated area from which they could access a pool of workers. Washington Street, many of you might be familiar with Washington Street, which ran parallel to Yesler Way, was one of the main workers' hubs during the late 19th century. It was a popular docking place for Indigenous workers who were stopping over in Seattle from around the region. So that's the base of Washington Street right there in the photo. And then it was also a hub of Chinese labor as well. And this is a photograph of Huachong, a company that was very prominent in Seattle in the late 19th century. And Huachong's main business was labor contracting, so recruiting and managing Chinese workers for railroad companies and lumber mills and canneries. And Huachong's main building was located just steps away from the waterfront on Washington Street, where you also have Indigenous workers docking, right, their canoes. This is also the place on Washington Street where the IWW established its first headquarters in 1907. So racial segregation and Seattle's north-south orientation also played a crucial role in the regional economy, giving employers access to a concentrated pool of labor. So going back to my original question, though, what can we learn about Seattle history by centering the experiences of workers like Frank, right? First, we can learn that migratory laborers played a far more crucial role in shaping the urban environment than previously acknowledged. And as I said, we see this through the efforts to police and contain them, which gave rise to a segregated landscape that became an inextricable part of the built environment of the city, most visibly through this kind of north-south spatial and racial orientation of Seattle. Second, what do we learn? Well, we learn that Seattle was a lot more racially heterogeneous than is often acknowledged in the historical scholarship and in the public understanding of Seattle's history. Growing up, I heard all the time, like, Seattle is a white city. Seattle often appears on the list of, the whitest cities in the United States. It's always in the top, 7 or top 5. But this obscures, I think, a history of racial heterogeneity that was really central to this early period. And it obscures the fluidity of the urban population. And in highlighting this particular aspect of Seattle's history, I'm building on scholarship by Quintard Taylor, Shelley Lee, Dorothy Fujita Roney, Cole Thrush, who have all in their various ways pushed back against this notion of the white city and highlighted the ways in which, for example, Seattle has been so connected to Asia and the Pacific world, in which Indigenous peoples were central actors in shaping Seattle and their persistence in the city over time, that African Americans had a historical presence in Seattle that was truly significant. And so I build on this work, and I'm indebted to the scholars, right, who, again, pushed back a little bit on this narrative of the white city. But I'm also kind of expanding on this work and building on this work. And I'm grappling with a kind of racial heterogeneity that's not rooted necessarily in one group of people or one community. I wanted to kind of expand the framework to include many different groups of workers and their interactions with each other over time. And what we see is that segregation into the urban spaces of the city and labor camps and sites of work and leisure created a highly fluid and heterogeneous urban environment that I trace in the book, and that really defies easy categorization. And so I don't necessarily focus on one stable community that is grounded in place and grows and expands over time. And when you focus on transient workers, migratory workers, mobile populations, you're not going to get a stable history, right? What you get are urban spaces that are constantly in flux, snapshots of urban populations that look very different day to day, month to month, year to year, season to season. People are constantly mingling, fighting, and coming together in different ways, in different spaces, at different moments. Historian Nayan Shah calls this stranger intimacy. And some of my most favorite passages of the book and the research that I did to highlight this really discuss moments in which we see the messiness and the complexity of this particular urban population who had been segregated together in many of the same physical spaces as I describe with the sawdust example a bit earlier. In 1903, to give an example of this from the book, A Japanese writer named Nagai Kafu toured the Pacific Northwest. He was an admirer of the French writer Émile Zola and wanted to come to the US to capture the sights and sounds of the region's emerging cities for his Japanese audiences back home. And his work is really interesting. So it was translated and published, I think in the 1970s, is very engaged with the question of racial heterogeneity and the place of Japanese people, again, that was his focus, in the mixed world of the segregated South End. And so I just wanted to read a short passage from his writing, which is in chapter 3 of the book. Kafu spent considerable time in Seattle, where he resided in the raucous working-class district of the city's South End. There, each night, he observed, quote, crowds of menial laborers who had finished their day's work, wandering the district's, quote, lantern-lit alleys and filling the air with the, quote, distinct odor of sweat and alcohol. From this tangle of narrow streets, quote, poured an unending stream of human voices, mingled with the sound of gramophones from taverns and shooting galleries and the raucous sounds of a circus band. He described the district coming alive in the evening hours, the revelry often lasting until sunrise, when laborers went back to their lodging houses or headed to their work sites for another day on the job. Though he commented on many different topics, Kafu appeared most struck by the heterogeneity of the district. When he arrived, he noted, quote, both Oriental and Occidental laborers frequenting the same cigar shops and fruit stands. Particularly noteworthy to Kafu were the moments that showed Japanese residents' integration within the South End and their coexistence with whites as well as people from other racial groups. He recalled hearing the, quote, hard, flat sounds of the shamisen, which is a traditional Japanese instrument, next door to a saloon, and white children who yelled sukebe, a Japanese vulgarity that roughly translated into lecher, or dirty old man. Quote, it had been used by Japanese prostitutes and came to have a special meaning, Kafu explained. And now I found the word circulating among the lower class people of America. What he conveyed with these writings was integration in the truest sense, not just people living in the same district and working alongside one another, but also the new forms of social and cultural life that emerged from such proximity. So what he's showing us, I think, is that he's not just commenting on the fact that there was a racially heterogeneous district in Seattle, but something new emerged out of this district as well, a new kinds of cultural and social life that he's showing us. Again, he also notes there was tension, hostility, it wasn't a utopia. But I think what he's commenting on that's kind of mixing that's going on that's really significant, and again, emerging out of these segregated, heterogeneous spaces of Seattle. And this is, I wanted to put this photograph here. This is the kind of streetscape that Kafu would have been traversing there in 1903 when he came to Seattle. Another moment in the book that I highlight, the kind of racial heterogeneity of the city that we find in the city segregated spaces housing migratory workers, is a neighborhood called Profanity Hill, the so-called slum district that was cleared away to build Yesler Terrace in 1940. So Profanity Hill was what existed before Yesler Terrace was built, kind of the location of First Hill today. Profanity Hill emerged in the 1930s to house workers and others who wanted to move further east, away from the city center and away from the crowded conditions. Seattle was, again, highly restricted at this time in terms of housing. And so it was a place where people who couldn't find homes elsewhere in the city were able to move to and to reside. And what I show in the last chapter of my book on Profanity Hill is that the community that was deemed an expendable slum housed a very rich and diverse, mixed, integrated neighborhood. And I was able to reconstruct this neighborhood through the 1940 census, which took a long time. So I was able to actually, through the census, trace, at least have a snapshot of the people who were living in Profanity Hill on the eve of its demolition. And so this was, Profanity Hill was the least white neighborhood in the entire city. And it was A lot of Japanese families had lived there, single male laborers, a lot of interracial families as well. So just to give you a highlight of the kinds of people that were living, some of the residents of Profanity Hill, on the left is Jim Akutsu, who some of you may know. He's kind of a very well-known figure in Seattle history. He was a leader of the draft resistance movement and camp, and he was actually the inspiration behind John Okada's No No Boy, which is a classic of Asian American literature that was set in Seattle, and apparently he was the inspiration behind Ichiro, the main character. So in one duplex, we have the Akutsu family, where Jim, also Gene, his younger brother, lived as well with their parents. And they shared a duplex with the Egawa family. The Egawa family was a mixed Japanese native family consisting of Fred Egawa, there in the middle photo, who was a Japanese American from Hawaii who came to Seattle, I think at the age of 12, and he was a boxer, a professional or amateur boxer. And he married Grace Celestine Egawa, who was a member of the Lummi Nation and who was living in Seattle at the time. And they had 3 children. This is the photograph of the Egawa couple. And then I just wanted to flag on the right. I know about this story, actually, and I had heard about this before because their son, Jim Egawa, testified about his parents' story in 1981 during the Seattle redress hearings. And I had listened, actually, I've listened to the redress hearings before, and his story, stuck with me because Jim, who is mixed, Native and Japanese, talked about, his mother. And his mother made the decision after Pearl Harbor to go to Minidoka to be with her family. She wasn't Japanese herself, and so he talks about this in his testimony, and I included there's a written testimony there, a copy of it. And I think, he was trying to bring his mother's experience into the historical record in that moment of, the redress hearings. And so this was the kind of, these were the residents who were living on Profanity Hill that was deemed an expendable slum by the city and cleared to make way for Yesler Terrace. So the economy and spatial organization of Seattle brought people together in new ways, fostered a kind of racially heterogeneous and constantly shifting urban population that was significant historically. And yet, the existence of these kinds of integrated communities also threatened a social and economic order rooted in racial division and hierarchy. And this is my third point. What can we learn by writing Seattle history from the margins? We learn not only that Seattle was more racially heterogeneous than previously acknowledged and understood, but that this racial mixture was threatening to people in positions of power. The entire economy was built around, again, racial hierarchy and division, and yet the sawdust and other mixed kind of districts like it show people coming together in ways that are unexpected and unpredictable, allowing for a kind of autonomy in the way people were living their lives and their relationships with each other that people in positions of power couldn't ever quite control. So I opened this talk discussing Frank Kubo and learning more about his early life as a laborer in Seattle and how the city was physically built to maintain a class of mobile laborers. And yet what I learned myself in writing this book and really thinking about this project a lot and thinking about Seattle history was this entire structure, right? This economic system, this political system, system of racial segregation was a lot more fragile than I had first believed. I think I had in my mind this idea that people in industry, people in city government were kind of all powerful, that they could snap their fingers and bend the city to their will. They could impose their vision of the city as they wanted. And yet that's not what I found at all. And in fact, I was surprised at just how little control they did have at certain moments, when the entire society of the Pacific Northwest at that point really was on the verge of collapsing. And this happened at various moments in the agricultural industries in the 1870s and 1880s, with the labor movements in the 19-teens, with the unruly residents of the South End districts in the 1920s. This wasn't a force of nature that couldn't be stopped. But in fact, what I learned and what I try to focus on in the book is that it can be undone and indeed frequently nearly undone time and time again. So I wanted to close actually with another passage from my book related to that point, that the concluding chapter of my first, the concluding paragraph of my first chapter on the sawdust, right? And the chapter is about racial segregation. It's about the removal and segregation of the Duwamish and then the Chinese, and about the formation of Mill Street as that kind of dividing line in the city. But I wanted to end with this point. And yet the preponderance of restrictive ordinances city leaders passed from the 1860s through the 1880s reveals the porousness of these boundaries. Laws kept appearing because Mill Street did not stand as an impenetrable barrier. People on the ground challenged the top-down vision of Seattle by pursuing their own agendas and navigating the landscape on their own terms. These challenges would continue to pose problems, not just for city officials, but for employers and industry leaders who drew on Seattle's concentration of Indigenous and Chinese labor to power the regional economy. Hop farmers in particular utilized maritime networks traversed by Indigenous and Chinese workers to access a highly mobile labor force needed for the short 3-week picking season. As the farmers soon came to realize, however, the mobility of the workforce and its concentration in Seattle made their industry possible, but also created the conditions for the industry's potential undoing. In that way, sawdust was an apt metaphor for Seattle's first segregated district, a waste product used to lay the foundations of the city, the literal ground around which Seattle developed, but one that was, in the end, not so solid after all. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for coming and listening. I look forward to your questions.
And just to be clear, because we're recording this with the Seattle channel, we've got a microphone up front. If you're able to make it up to the microphone to ask your question, that would be best. If you can't, then Megan, perhaps you can restate the question.
Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Don't be shy. Any questions, comments, reflections?
First off, thank you very much. This is very informative. I'm struck by I'll go back to Bernard Bailyn's concept of the peopling of North America, if you may be familiar with that. It's an interesting concept, except that it leaves out the Native Americans who were there first. But it's the idea of the trajectory and the intentions of Northern European immigrant populations and how they came to the Eastern United States. I think it applies on the West Coast as well. So what I'm curious about is, do you see different intentions and agendas by Frank and other immigrant populations, and how they ended up getting channeled either into the itinerant labor or into a maybe peripheral but still stable middle class?
Yes, thank you for that question. I don't know, were people able to hear it? Okay. Yeah, so I think, people came like Frank for, very similar reasons, and yet the opportunities that they had were so shaped by race and racial hierarchy. I mean, that's something that I really, really learned while writing this book, is that how much race in particular shaped the kinds of jobs that they could take, right? In some ways, migratory labor was foisted upon Asian Indigenous peoples. They couldn't really get jobs that were outside of this world. And so that's one thing. And so I think, yes, there were European and American-born white workers who were also, in this industry. They were very present. And yet they had a kind of degree of mobility and opportunity that was not available to the other groups of workers that I talk about. So I do think that race was a factor in shaping, who could make it to the middle class and who remained kind of migratory in these migratory laboring positions. I will say that one thing I talk about, though, I do have a chapter on Japanese on Japanese participation in this economy. And actually, that group was able to amass a degree of power. Frank wasn't really part of that kind of world, but so I'm attentive to the class differences within the Japanese community. And that had to do actually with the power of Japan. Japan as an empire, Japan as a global power. And Japan was able to influence immigration laws in the US and allow Japanese women to come. It allowed Japanese people to have families, they could have children, and with these big families open up businesses like hotels and farms that allowed them to accumulate a degree of wealth and also power in this system. So I would say that race to me is a factor, and yet we also see ways in which some workers are able to kind of step up into the middle class or outside of this world as well. But thank you for the question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I don't know if it's, thank you so much for this talk. So I was really interested in your discussion about Yesler Way. So I guess the first part of the question was once they raised Profanity Hill, who moved in to Yesler Way? Was it white folks? And so do we see gentrification of parts of the city happening then? And then I work a little bit with local organizations documenting the history of redlining in Seattle. And so I was really interested by your talk because you're talking about migratory populations, right? It's less about house deeds and thinking more about renting. And so how did that process work in terms of segregation, and how did that really change over the course of the early 20th century?
Thank you so much. So the first question was about Profanity Hill, and what replaced Profanity Hill was Yesler Terrace. Thank you so much for asking that, because yes, what replaced Profanity Hill was a public housing project called Yesler Terrace, which some of you might be familiar with, the history of that. And I found actually that Yesler Terrace was a New Deal, funded by the New Deal, and it was envisioned for white families and it differed a little bit from other housing projects at the time in that it allowed a tiny number of non-white families to gain entry and live there. But it was envisioned primarily for white families. And it was enforced in a variety of ways. Only US citizens could live in Yesler Terrace. You had to be legally married. So there are all these ways in which it didn't necessarily say whites only, but it kind of worked in ways that were more subtle to maintain that population. It's something that I talk about in the book, and I end with World War II, because we do see a shift in the economy of Seattle away from kind of resource extraction and agriculture and towards manufacturing. And this played a role in the kinds of housing, the kinds of neighborhoods that were changing, and the city underwent huge demolition projects. Profanity Hill was just one of many. Hooverville was also a shanty town, was also burned down to the ground that same year. So in some ways, I talk about how the city is kind of displacing and clearing away the spaces that had served the migratory workers in this previous economic kind of system to make way for this white, family sort of quote unquote skilled workforce that was going to come work at Boeing, for example. So that's the first part. And the second was about redlining. Oh, and how that worked in terms of housing. So yes, so that's an interesting question, because what I talk about, it's kind of like the prehistory of redlining, is first of all, a lot of municipal codes and policies that restrict people, through vagrancy laws, public health, other mechanisms to restrict into the southern part of the city. What we see as well also is the different forms of housing that start to emerge that look very different from north versus south. So what we see in the south end are a lot of lodging houses and hotels. Seattle actually had one of the highest concentrations of hotels in the entire country by the 1920s. And so you see this kind of particular built environment emerge in the South End that works in concert with these municipal laws to push people into these areas. And so what you have a lot, and I think I showed a picture of a photograph of the kind of streets, a typical streetscape south of Yesler in 1903. It looks a little bit different by the 20s and 30s. You have these more larger kind of SRO style hotels, that some of them are actually still around in the International District, Chinatown. But the hotel was actually very important to this economic system because it was a place of short-term housing. So people could live there, but it also facilitated their migration and made it so that they couldn't actually stay in one place. So yeah, that's kind of how it worked as well, to kind of both concentrate people and also to work with this kind of broader system of labor migration. Yeah, you're welcome. Anything else? Oh, yeah.
I haven't had the good fortune of reading your book as yet, so you may already have answered this in your book. The sex ratios in the Japanese American community and the Chinese American community were probably very different. To what extent were there intermarriages across those two communities? And to what extent did Chinese Americans marry into the indigenous community? And how many of these kinds of pairings were the result of residential patterns or work patterns?
So I love this question about interracial marriage, interethnic sort of racial relationships. So what I found is that Japanese leaders and elites policed the marriage choices of the women in the community. So there were a lot of taboos around marrying, and for Japanese people, race, didn't just mean white. It meant Chinese, Filipinos were considered to be racially inferior to Japanese people, right, according to the logic, right, of the time. And so there was a lot of policing there of, so Japanese women would enter into, for example, relationships with Chinese men or Filipino men that would result in these huge scandals in the community. So there's a lot of policing of interethnic relationships, right, between Japanese women and men of other races and ethnicities. I think, but of course, right, there was a lot of policing going on, and yet people still entered into relationships and got married too, but there was definitely a taboo there. I would say residential patterns or work patterns. I think they're both so tightly related. It's hard for me to say. I'm just thinking about the moments in my book that I do talk about interracial marriage, and there's one chapter that looks at Bainbridge Island and looks at marriages between Filipino men and Coast Salish women who are meeting on, in the fields, in the strawberry fields, picking berries for Japanese farmers. So that's definitely a kind of work, I think, experience, and this happened in the canneries as well. But I also think it's so related, because this was part of a kind of the same network, and people were traversing, the city centers. They were traversing the same kinds of routes, and they were working the same kinds of jobs, and they were meeting in all these different places. So it's hard to also disentangle that. So I would say a little bit of both. I do know that the Egawas, the Grace and Fred Egawa, met in a store in the South End. So that was kind of related to, right, where they were living at the time. So I think it just depended. But I do think that I wanted to stress in the book that, people obviously make their own decisions about these things in romantic relationships, and yet it's important to understand how and why people come together in the moments that they do. And it did have to do with, work options, and it did have to do with also segregation in the city. So I would say both of those things.
Thank you.
You're welcome.